The British Empire had conquered kingdoms on nearly every continent. Its armies carried modern rifles, artillery, and the confidence of a global superpower. By the late 19th century, Britain controlled vast territories across Africa, Asia, and beyond. Most believed its expansion was unstoppable. But in 1879, on the plains of southern Africa, an African kingdom did something almost unimaginable. It destroyed a British army. Thousands of imperial soldiers entered Zulu territory, believing the campaign would be short, simple, and decisive. British officers mocked the Zulu military as primitive warriors, armed mostly with spears and shields. The empire expected another easy colonial victory. Instead, what followed became one of the greatest military disasters in British history. Before we begin, if you believe the world deserves to hear the stories history tried to bury, subscribe now. This channel uncovers the forgotten empires, kings, warriors, and battles erased from popular history. And this story may be one of the most extraordinary war stories ever recorded. To understand how the British Empire suffered such a humiliating defeat, you first have to understand the kingdom standing in its path. The Zulu kingdom emerged in southern Africa during the early 19th century under the leadership of Shaka Zulu. Before Shaka's rise, the region consisted of many smaller chiefdoms competing for land, cattle, and survival. Warfare existed long before him, but Shaka transformed it completely. He reorganized military structure, introduced strict discipline, and revolutionized battlefield tactics. Young men were grouped into age-based regiments called Amabuto. Training became relentless. Warriors marched barefoot across rough terrain to harden their feet and endurance. Retreat in battle was often punished by death. Shaka also changed weaponry. Instead of relying mainly on throwing spears, he emphasized close combat using the ikwa, a short stabbing spear designed for brutal hand-to-hand fighting. Large cowhide shields became essential for defense and aggressive maneuvering. Most importantly, he perfected battlefield formations. The most famous was the horns of the buffalo. The enemy would be pinned by the central force, the chest, while fast-moving regiments swept around both flanks like horns, surrounding the target completely. Reserve forces waited behind to reinforce weak points or pursue fleeing enemies. Under this military system, the Zulu kingdom expanded rapidly. Neighboring groups feared its armies. European observers were stunned by the organization and discipline of Zulu warfare. By the late 1870s, the Zulu kingdom was ruled by Cetshwayo Kapande, commonly known as Cetshwayo. He had officially become king in 1873, though he had already exercised enormous power for years before his coronation. Cetshwayo was not the savage caricature later painted by colonial propaganda. He was politically intelligent, cautious, and deeply aware of British expansion across southern Africa. He understood the danger the empire represented. At the same time, Britain misunderstood him completely. Many British officials viewed African kingdoms through the lens of racial superiority. They saw advanced African political systems as temporary obstacles rather than legitimate states. To them, conquest was inevitable. Southern Africa had become increasingly important to Britain. The empire wanted regional control stretching across modern South Africa. Independent African powers disrupted those ambitions. And among all African states in the region, the Zulu kingdom possessed the strongest indigenous military force. One British official played a particularly important role in pushing the region toward war: Sir Henry Bartle Frere. Frere wanted political confederation under British authority. But as long as the Zulu kingdom remained independent and militarily powerful, that vision faced a serious obstacle. So Britain began searching for justification. Border disputes between the British-controlled colony of Natal and the Zulu kingdom became increasingly tense. Incidents along the frontier were exaggerated. Diplomatic pressure intensified. Then, in December 1878, Britain delivered an ultimatum to Cetshwayo. The demands were impossible. The Zulu military system had to be dismantled. Warriors were expected to disband. British interference in Zulu internal affairs would dramatically increase. Cetshwayo was essentially being asked to surrender his kingdom's sovereignty without a fight. He attempted diplomacy. He wanted to avoid war. Multiple historical records show that Cetshwayo understood the destructive power of European firearms and hoped conflict could still be prevented. But Britain had already decided. On January 11, 1879, British forces invaded Zululand. The invasion was commanded by Frederick Thesiger, 2nd Baron Chelmsford, better known as Lord Chelmsford. British forces crossed into Zulu territory in multiple columns, expecting rapid victory. The confidence among British officers was extraordinary. They possessed Martini-Henry rifles capable of firing at long range. They had artillery, rocket batteries, professional imperial troops, colonial auxiliaries, mounted units. Against them stood warriors carrying shields and spears. Many British soldiers believed the war would be over within weeks. But the Zulus were watching carefully. Zulu scouts tracked British movements constantly. Cetshwayo ordered defensive war initially, instructing his forces not to invade Natal unless necessary. Yet once British troops crossed into Zululand, massive Zulu mobilization began. Then came the battle that changed everything. The Battle of Isandlwana. On January 22, 1879, a large British camp stood beneath the shadow of Isandlwana Hill. Chelmsford had divided his force earlier that day, taking several units away to search for Zulu forces he believed were retreating elsewhere. It was a catastrophic mistake. Inside the camp remained around 1,700 British and colonial troops. Despite being deep inside enemy territory, defensive fortifications were incomplete. Wagons had not been formed into strong defensive barriers. British commanders underestimated the speed and coordination of the Zulu army. Meanwhile, approximately 20,000 Zulu warriors moved silently nearby. They had hidden in a valley not far from the camp. British scouts unexpectedly discovered them late in the morning. Suddenly, thousands of warriors rose from the earth itself. The Zulu attack began immediately. The horns of the buffalo formation unfolded across the battlefield with terrifying precision. The central chest moved directly toward British firing lines, while the horns swept outward, aiming to encircle the camp completely. At first, British rifle fire inflicted devastating casualties. Warriors fell in large numbers as disciplined volleys tore through advancing ranks. But the Zulus kept coming. Again and again. Closer. Closer. British soldiers later described the speed of the Zulu advance with shock. Warriors used terrain brilliantly, moving through tall grass and depressions in the ground to minimize exposure. Their mobility overwhelmed British expectations. Then the battlefield began collapsing.
One major problem involved ammunition distribution. British logistics struggled under pressure. Ammunition boxes reportedly proved difficult to open quickly, while firing lines stretched dangerously far from the camp itself. As Zulu forces pressed closer, communication and resupply became chaotic. The British lines started breaking apart. Zulu horns wrapped around the flanks. Retreat paths narrowed. Units became isolated. Hand-to-hand combat erupted across the field. Now the advantage of the Iklua became horrifyingly clear. British soldiers trained primarily for rifle warfare suddenly faced thousands of warriors charging directly into close combat. Bayonets clashed against stabbing spears. Smoke covered the battlefield. Gunfire mixed with screams. Entire British units were overwhelmed where they stood. The fighting became desperate and chaotic. Officers attempted to regroup men around the camp, but Zulu regiments poured through collapsing defensive positions. Soldiers tried fleeing toward the Buffalo River, pursued relentlessly. By the end of the battle, the British force had been annihilated. Over 1,300 British and colonial troops were dead. It was one of the worst defeats ever inflicted on a modern European army by an indigenous African force during the colonial era. And the world could hardly believe it. News of Isandlwana stunned Britain. Newspapers across the empire reported the disaster with disbelief. How could an army equipped with modern rifles and artillery be destroyed by African warriors using mostly traditional weapons? For Victorian Britain, the defeat was deeply humiliating. The empire had spent decades building an image of military superiority and racial invincibility. Isandlwana shattered that illusion. Suddenly, the British public realized something terrifying. The empire could bleed. The Zulu victory sent shockwaves through Europe and beyond. Military observers studied the battle carefully. Many recognized the extraordinary discipline and tactical coordination displayed by the Zulu army. But Britain would not accept humiliation quietly. The empire prepared revenge. Reinforcements flooded into South Africa. More troops, more artillery, more cavalry. Britain committed overwhelming industrial military power to crush the Zulu kingdom completely. Yet even after Isandlwana, the war remained dangerous. The same day as the disaster, another smaller engagement took place at Rorke's Drift. There, a tiny British garrison successfully defended a mission station against repeated Zulu assaults. British media heavily promoted the defense afterward, partly because the government desperately needed a heroic narrative to counterbalance the catastrophe at Isandlwana. Still, the reality remained unavoidable. The British Empire had suffered a devastating defeat. As the war continued, British strategy changed significantly. Commanders became more cautious. Defensive fortifications improved. Troops formed lagers and entrenched camps more consistently. Open vulnerability like Isandlwana would not be repeated. Meanwhile, the Zulu kingdom faced enormous pressure. The Zulu military system depended heavily on courage, mobility, and discipline, but Britain possessed industrial advantages impossible to ignore forever. Modern supply systems, endless reinforcements, artillery, Gatling guns, and sustained imperial resources gradually shifted the balance. The British response became increasingly destructive. Zulu homesteads were burned, crops destroyed, entire regions destabilized. The conflict escalated into a campaign designed not simply to win battles, but to dismantle the Zulu kingdom permanently. Despite these pressures, Zulu resistance continued fiercely. In March 1879, British forces suffered another serious setback at the Battle of Hlobane, where Zulu attacks inflicted significant losses during a chaotic retreat. The war was proving far more difficult than British planners had imagined.
But eventually, overwhelming imperial power began taking effect. On July 4, 1879, the decisive Battle of Ulundi took place. This time, the British came prepared. Thousands of troops formed a massive defensive square supported by artillery and Gatling guns. The formation created overlapping fields of fire capable of unleashing devastating destruction in every direction. Zulu regiments launched courageous assaults against the British square, but the firepower was overwhelming. Warriors charged through exploding artillery shells and relentless rifle fire. Hundreds fell before reaching British lines. Those who managed to close the distance faced concentrated bayonet defenses and continuous gunfire. The battle ended in disaster for the Zulu army. Ulundi effectively broke organized Zulu military resistance. Soon afterward, Cetshwayo was captured. The king who had once stood against the British Empire was taken into exile. The Zulu kingdom itself was divided into smaller territories under British influence, weakening centralized authority permanently. Yet, despite British victory in the war, something important had changed forever. The empire had learned that conquest would not always come easily. At Isandlwana, African warriors had demonstrated military discipline, strategic sophistication, and battlefield courage on a level many Europeans had arrogantly assumed impossible. The battle forced even British officers to acknowledge the fighting ability of the Zulu army. Today, Isandlwana remains one of the most studied battles in colonial military history. Historians continue debating British mistakes, Zulu tactics, logistical failures, and command decisions, but one fact is undeniable. The Zulu victory was real. It was not myth. It was not propaganda. It was one of the greatest battlefield defeats ever suffered by the British Empire during the 19th century. And at the center of that story stands Cetshwayo. He did not destroy the British Empire. He did not stop colonial expansion across Africa. Eventually, his kingdom fell beneath industrial imperial power. But he achieved something few leaders facing the British Empire ever accomplished. He humiliated it. For one extraordinary moment in history, on a battlefield beneath an African mountain, the most powerful empire on earth watched its army collapse before warriors it had dismissed as inferior. That memory never disappeared. Even after the war ended, the Battle of Isandlwana became a symbol across Africa and the colonized world. It showed that European armies were not invincible. Courage, discipline, and leadership could still shake empires. Cetshwayo himself would later briefly return to Zululand in the 1880s after political pressure in Britain shifted somewhat in his favor. But the kingdom he returned to was fractured and unstable. Internal conflict and colonial interference had already weakened it beyond repair. He died in 1884. But his legacy survived long after him. Today, the story of the Anglo-Zulu War continues to fascinate historians because it shattered simplistic narratives about colonial conquest. Too often, African resistance is portrayed as hopeless or disorganized. The Zulu kingdom proved otherwise. Its army operated with remarkable tactical coordination. Its leadership understood diplomacy and strategy. Its warriors fought one of the greatest military powers of the age and inflicted a defeat so severe that Britain spent generations trying to explain it away. History often remembers empires, but sometimes history remembers the people who stood against them. And on the plains of Isandlwana, the Zulu kingdom carved its name permanently into military history, not because it conquered the world, but because it forced the world to respect it. If this story changed the way you see African history, share this video. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the Zulu kingdom and the Battle of Isandlwana. And subscribe now for more forgotten stories of kings, warriors, empires, and battles history tried to erase. Because the greatest stories in history are often the ones the world was never supposed to remember.